The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Golenbock University, the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tyko, and not only is Peter Golenbock here tonight, Alan Blumkin, the third baseball Michiganer, as we call ourselves, David Hubler. How are you? We're welcoming you. You could really be the fourth, and we're glad to have you. David Hubler of Authoring Experience, the Nats and the Grays, and we're delighted to have you amongst us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's quite a distinguished group that I'm sort of butting in on.
Well, it's two-thirds of a distinguished group, and there's me. So let's get that correct. We're talking off the air a little bit. Alan brought us to the fact that Trammell and Morris were elected by a special committee to the Hall of Fame. They will be up there on the podium.
Do you have any idea who the people are who are on the sort of modern day committee? Do you know who these people are? Are they other players? Are they players?
I think Facebook listed some of them. I think it's probably readily available, but I don't know off the top of my head. Players like Dave Parker and Don Mattingly were Dale Murphy. I'm sure the Braves fans would be very upset by that one, or not among the chosen. And they did not.
Murphy's an interesting. He's an interesting figure.
Yeah, they did not name Marvin Miller either.
And they didn't name Marvin Miller either?
Wow.
They had the power to do that and didn't.
Yeah.
Now, what committee is this? Because these are not the old timers.
Modern, whatever, for the last 30, 40 years or so.
Well, why do they need them when they have the Baseball Writers Association?
No, it's not. This has nothing to do with the baseball writers.
Well, I think what happens is
that won't be released till next month.
Beginning of next month.
Yeah, I know that.
After 10 years, a player falls off the list. And some of the players who fall off the list clearly belong in the Hall of Fame. And so without knowing this as a fact, my suspicion is that what this committee is to look at those players who have fallen off the list after 10 years, take a look back and say, maybe Richie Allen belongs in the Hall of Fame. Maybe Gil Hodges belongs in the Hall of Fame. Maybe, Jack Morris and Allen, Trammell belong in the Hall of Fame.
Now, were those the two that you mentioned before, Trammell and Morris, Richie Allen and Gil Hodges, were they on that list? Could have they been selected?
No, Hodges is. There's a group I'm in on Facebook called Gil Hodges belongs to the Hall of Fame, and he won't be eligible till I think 2020, whatever committee they set up for that. This was just players basically from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, both.
Since I'm a kid, they must have had 20 different methods.
And the early 90s, like Don Mattingly was one, Yeah.
I just thought to say that since I'm a kid, the Hall of Fame has had upwards of 20, 25 different ways of selecting Hall of Fame members.
It occurred to me, since we've got Dave Hubler here, he wrote this book about the Nats and the Grays.
Right.
The Grays, I gather, the Homestead Grays.
Yes, exactly.
And the Nats must be the Washington Nats, no?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's wartime. Mm-hmm.
Wartime. So I would love to hear, having written this book, I would love to hear about it and what he's got to say about the two of them.
About the two teams?
Yeah, about the two teams, yes.
Well, what a lot of people, as I've said on previous podcasts that one of the things that has always been a sore point with Washington fans who know the history is that the charge against Clark Griffith was that he was a racist and he wouldn't allow the black players he wouldn't sign any black players. But the point of one of the points of the book is that the Grays and the Washington Nationals were his only source of revenue throughout his ownership of the team, whereas some of the other players, some of the other team owners, had other businesses like beer businesses.
Phil Wrigley had his gum, for instance.
Wrigley Yeah, they all had something else. Cincinnati, the owners were big in electronics. So what Griffith did was he used the revenue from the Homestead Grays as part of his cash, let's say, to improve his ball club, and he was not a stingy man, despite what some in the press thought of him. When I first started to do this book, and as a novel, Peter, I actually interviewed a number of the players who were on the 1944 Washington Nationals team.
Wow.
And fortunately for me, I saved the tapes because when it came time to write the actual history of that era, I was able to use some of the material that they had told me. By that time, unfortunately, they had all passed away.
Of course.
So, but it was quite poignant. The book, to me, was the history of that era was so different from anything we've experienced since in terms of baseball, fandom, the whole notion. One of the stories I always like to tell about in researching the book was that about mid-year in 1944, the War Transportation Board decided that the draft board, decided that players who would come to the States, and they were mostly on Washington, they came from Cuba, their visa or their special entry permit, which was due to expire at the end of September, was now going to expire unless they joined the military. So in the middle of the season, about 5 ball players from Washington up and packed their bags and headed home to Cuba in the middle of the season. And Clark Griffith, who was a very close friend of Roosevelt and also was a good friend and lunch companion of General, what's his name? Hershey, Louis B. Hershey, from the Selective Service System, they worked out a deal that allowed these guys to come back. So they were gone a couple of weeks at the most, but some of them had trouble getting back because of transportation problems. So the era of the war era itself is unique in baseball history, I believe. And it's not a question of that, well, they were, pick-up players, they were minor leaguers, they were guys past the hill. Yeah, there were some of those too, but there was still tremendous competition, and some very interesting season-ending pennant chases. And of course, one of the interesting things I found was that Washington always got that label, first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. Mm-hmm. Well, they were last, but only in 1944. They hadn't been last for maybe 20 years prior to that, and that was only once before. And they finished twice in second place during the war. But they weren't that bad a team. It was later on that they really became bad.
Right.
In the 50s.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. 1944, interestingly enough, the team that won the pennant was the St. Louis Browns.
Right.
You talk about being last in the American League. The St. Louis Browns were a team that very often drew something like 4,000 fans a game for the season. So
they were terrible. Yeah.
They had something like 280,000 people as their attendance for half of 154 games.
Even in that final series at the end of the season, when they were competing for the pennant, it was only the last game that they really sold out the place. What's interesting too is that the Washington Nationals had a hand in helping St. Louis win the pennant, despite the fact that the two teams hated each other. St. Louis was a very segregated city at the time.
Right.
Nasty invective hurled because Washington had about the Cuban ball players, the same Cubans we were just talking about.
Right.
They got into fights. There was a lot of heckling, a lot of terrible name calling, and the two managers who had been friends and teammates years earlier never spoke to each other after that because of the terrible fighting and name calling that went on. But it was because Washington was able to beat Detroit in '44, the last series of the season. And that too has an interesting sort of Damon Runyon-esque character to it. The last game, just about the last game of the season, there was an attempt to bribe Washington to throw the game. What's his name? The pitcher.
Pitcher for whom?
For Washington, the star pitcher. Thank you. Dutch Leonard, sure. Dutch Leonard got a call, and the guy said, how'd you like to make about $10,000? Well, $10,000 for one game was
a fortune.
Way beyond a fortune. And he was so upset and shocked by this that he hung up the phone, and he actually told George Case Jr. about this. And we had George Case III, his son, on lots of times, and George is a wonderful guy, and he authenticated.
George was a left fielder for Washington at the time.
Yeah, and he authenticated the story. So
do we
George
know who
Case
made the phone call? Do we know who?
No, we've never found out who made the phone call. But George Case told him, go to the coach, go to the manager, go to R.C. Blugy, the manager, tell him what's going on. And he did, and because he told him, he was not brought up on any kind of charges or anything. There was no investigation. Actually, he went out and won the ball game. So, but they never found out who did it. And of course, Detroit was known as a gambling town at that point.
That's right.
So by beating the Tigers, the question was then if St. Louis was playing the Yankees in St. Louis, and there was an hour's time difference. So when it was known that when it was known that Washington had beaten Detroit, the fans were going nuts in St. Louis for the one time, perhaps all year, when they really rooted for the Browns. And, of course, the Browns came out and won the game. Had they lost the game, they would have had a one-game playoff.
Well, understand, in '44, St. Louis won 89 games and Detroit won 88 games. So they ended up winning the pennant by that one game.
Right. And another interesting facet is St. Louis's pitcher was a notorious drunk.
Jakaki.
Yeah.
Sid Jakaki, yeah.
Sid Jakaki, which is it's a strange, and he was a notorious drunk. They made him promise that he would not drink. The night before, the Browns had moved into a hotel just to keep them away from the families and all that other stuff because they were in St. Louis.
Right.
And Jakaki promised that he would not drink. Well, the next morning he came down. The morning of the game, he came down, and he was looped. One of his teammates said, "Look, you promised us you wouldn't drink last night." He said, "Yeah, that was last night, but today, and he pitched the game of his life.
Right.
So there were so many quirky things that happened in '44 and in the rest of the other 3 years of the 2.5 years of the war. And I found the whole thing fascinating and going through the research.
There were some really older players that came into wartime baseball that were brought back that clearly wouldn't have played in before or after. Some were questionable, some were right there. Who were some of those? And I think some of them were brought by Al Blumkin's Pirates. Were the Wainers?
No, Paul Wainer. There's a story I read about Paul Wainer that he finished up with the Yankees in 1944, and some fan, supposedly some fan yelled at him at Yankee Stadium, "Wainer, what are you doing here?" And he said, "DiMaggio's in the Army."
Yeah, but Wainer didn't play very much.
No. Jimmy Fox. There were a number of them that were able to hang around and play because the manpower shortage was so great.
I mean, you had the Yankee lineup had Nick Etten at first base, Stuffy Sternweiss at second base, Milosevic at shortstop, Oscar Grimes at third, Matheny in right, Johnny Lindell in center, and Martin was in left field, and Mike Garback was the catcher. None of these people, once the war ended and the other players came back, none of these people, continued to play. So
Lindell hung around for a while. Lindell
actually hung around for a while.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
he actually led the American League in on-base percentage in
He ended up being
1944.
the Philadelphia Phillies.
Yeah,
that's absolutely
there's a knuckleball
right.
came back to the Pirates, and the Pirates sold him to the Phillies.
Yeah, Lindell was an interesting character.
Yeah.
Lindell was very, very, very talented.
Yeah.
But just because they played during the war didn't mean that they weren't talented. They just weren't as talented as, Joe DiMaggio and Tommy Henrik and the rest of those boys who were.
Well, I think it was in '43, the All-Star game. There were about 5 or 6, and there were a number of prime Yankees. There were about 5 of them. That was the year that 6 Washington Nationals were voted into the All-Star game, including George Case, who was injured and didn't play.
Yeah,
but
Mickey Vernon, sure.
Yeah.
Jerry Pretty.
Yeah.
He was one of them.
Jerry Pretty.
And
Yeah.
the Yankee second baseman.
But the Yankees
he couldn't beat out Joe Gordon.
The Yankees
unloaded him. Yeah.
The Yankees were, considered. Well, the American League has been winning all these All-Star games because the Yankees are in there all the time.
That's right.
So Bucky Harris sat out all the Yankees the entire game. They didn't play, and the American League still won.
Wow.
That was but David, that was Joe McCarthy.
That was McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy, right?
Yeah.
The Yankee manager. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And in '43, it's interesting. '43, they had Etten, Joe Gordon, Frankie Grossetti, Billy Johnson, Matheny, Lindell, Charlie Keller. Dickey was still there, but by '44, the next year, most of those people were gone.
Yeah.
For quite a part of the war, a lot of these players sort of managed to stay in baseball, but there was such an outcry at a certain point that they started drafting these people. And
Peter,
that's
when
why,
you did your book, did you interview anybody from wartime baseball?
I interviewed the Cardinals and the Browns from 42, 43, 44. The Browns were a fascinating group, and this Ukiki was quite a character. When the Browns brought up their one-armed outfielder,
Pete Gray.
They hated him.
They hated him. They absolutely hated him. Mike Krivich was one of the outfielders, and Krivich was really quite a wonderful player. And the veterans all felt that the only reason Gray was playing was to draw fans, which is probably true. And so they used to do things like they used to buy a dead fish, and put the fish in the pocket of Pete Gray's sport jacket, and let the thing fester and smell like the son of a gun. Gray used to wear those straw hats, and so they used to yank the hat off his head and then punch through the top of it and, bust up his hat. They really, tortured the guy. They really.
Why was he so hated? What was the derivative of that?
Because it was a veteran team. The St. Louis Browns were a veteran team, and Gray was sort of an interloper who they felt did not have the talent to play in the major leagues. And that the only reason that the owner was playing this guy was that because he had, one arm, that people would come to see him, that he was, sort of a freak, that it was a circusy kind of a thing to do, rather than to have him because he could play ball.
But the Washington players didn't treat Bert Shepard that way the following season when he came up. Perhaps because he really only pitched in one game. But I think
that's true. But don't forget too, the Browns had some real sons of a bitches on their team.
Yes. Oh yeah.
They really did, and Jukicki was one of them. He was one of the worst. They had a pitcher by the name of Jack Kramer.
Yes.
And Jack Kramer was this fastidious guy. Kramer won 17 games in 1944. He was their top pitcher. But he was the sort of guy, he was from GQ magazine. He dressed beautifully. He used aftershave lotion. He was always just so-so. And some of his, rotten teammates used to take his clothing and throw it in the mud. That kind of thing. It just
Jack
he was
Kramer
the best pitcher.
pitched on the New York Giants in 1951 in that pennant-winning.
That's right.
A couple of games with the Yankees also that season.
Yeah.
He was a good pitcher. I mean, he
was a very good pitcher.
Yeah,
But there was a line there between the gentlemen and the not so gentlemen on that St. Louis Browns team. The drinkers and the non-drinkers, quite frankly. And Jukicki was the leader of the drinkers, and they were rough and tumble bunch. They were.
Peter, did you get to speak with Les Moss?
You want to know the truth? I don't remember whether I did or didn't.
Okay.
I interviewed a lot of those guys, and I just, I loved them to death. They were just. You were talking about the fact that you had the tapes of all your interviews. I've got the tapes of hundreds and hundreds of interviews that I've done over the years with the Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. My tapes of Mrs. Robinson and my tapes of Roy Campanella and Pee Wee Reese and so forth and so on.
You've got
somewhere
to get
along
them
the line.
Peter, you have to get them. Both of you guys need to get these tapes preserved, copied in some sort of laboratory. Please don't put that off.
A couple of years ago, the Smithsonian Institution received the taped interviews of one of the big radio sportscasters who had a regular. No, I don't think it was Bob Wolf, but it was in that type of sportscaster who donated all of his tapes to the Smithsonian. And they had a curator there who was going through all of them and categorizing them. And at that time, I had a tape. When I was at Voice of America Radio, I was up in Philadelphia covering a game one time when Pete Rose was playing for Philadelphia. And I did an interview with him in the dugout. And I asked him, I said, well, do you think you can actually break Ty Cobb's record? And Rose was like this encyclopedia of numbers, and he went on and on for a good few minutes. Well, I'd have to hit this, and I'd have to do that, and of course, and Rose, and Ty Cobb did this, and and he said, no, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that. So we added again when he did break it. But I spoke to the guy at the Smithsonian. He said, yeah, I'd love to have that for our collection. Well, I had to dig it out. I finally found it, and I haven't sent it to them yet. But I think that's, that would be a good place because they will preserve all of your interviews, and I'm sure they'll take them gladly.
Well, quite frankly, I'd like somebody to pay for them.
Okay.
I'd like somebody to pay for them, actually. Like the Hall of Fame, with Baseball Hall of Fame, they bought Barry Halper's entire collection. They bought Barry's, they could buy my tapes, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, and they have that section from sportscasters and radio announcers, so yeah, I would think that would be a fitting place, too.
Yeah, from what I understand, the Hall of Fame is so backlogged that they have warehouses where they store stuff that they don't exhibit, but don't make public.
Yeah, well, they get so many contributions,
Yeah.
Peter, you mentioned Barry Halper. He was your friend, am I correct?
He was a close friend of mine. Yes, he was.
Tell me something about his collection and just being in a room with his collection, if you know what I mean.
He had
just surrounded by.
He had the likeness of Babe Ruth that was in that wax museum, which was fabulous. He had Babe Ruth's Babe Ruth's the coat that Babe always wore.
Oh, that big camel-colored coat?
Yeah, the camel coat that he always wore. He had just about every baseball card that ever was, starting back with the very first baseball card of the Cincinnati Red Stockings back in 1869. He had marvelous collections. I mean, what he did was he and his family had a paper company. And what, the fairly wealthy did back then is they went and they took their extra money and they bought stock. What Barry Halper did is he took his extra money and he bought baseball cards. And from that, he then started buying, baseball autographs, and he bought baseball uniforms. I mean,
he'd have a room with his uniform, with these uniforms. I don't know, not on hangers, displayed.
Well, no. You go into where you take your clothing in to get it cleaned.
Dry clean.
Push your button, dry clean.
Oh yeah, right.
Oh, the rack.
The rack. He had a rack. You could push the number of the players whose uniform you wanted to see by push the button, and the door would open and the rack would roll around, and you could see, Babe Ruth's uniform or Lou Gehrig's uniform. There was a certain amount of controversy about Barry, something that I hadn't realized until after he died. But apparently, quite a few of the uniforms he had were fakes. Just unadulterated fakes. He had this need, apparently, to have complete collections of things. And with the uniforms, if he didn't have complete collections, apparently what he would do is he would come the closest that he could do to make up the uniforms that looked like the ones, So a lot of the uniforms, for instance, that the Hall of Fame bought from him are no longer, on their.
They've gone back and checked the authenticity.
Yeah, because, Barry had some people who were not kind to him. They resented him for one reason or another, and they went after him. And they discovered that quite a few of those uniforms were not genuine, unfortunately. But I can tell you, his baseball cards were certainly genuine. His autographs were genuine. He had the largest collection of baseball memorabilia that anybody ever had, and he did two things. He sold $10 million of it to the Hall of Fame, and the rest of it he sold at Sotheby's or one of these others. You can find the catalog. It's a marvelous catalog of the stuff that he used to own, and it too sold for another $20 million, something like that. So he had quite a collection. Before he died, I had invited him down to St. Petersburg. We had this, when I was living there in the early 1990s, we had empty, buildings. And I thought it would be terrific for him to take his collection and open it up down here as a museum. The American, what was I going to call it? The American something or other of our national pastime was going to be the name of the thing. And one of the owners of one of the buildings was going to rent out 2 floors of the building for his collection. And he came down. What I didn't know at the time was that he had diabetes, and he knew that he wasn't going to be around much longer. And so he wanted to sell his collection so that his wife wouldn't have to worry about it. And so after coming down, and I really thought for a minute that we were going to open this museum down here, and people would be able to pay $10 to come and see all his stuff. It would have been quite a marvelous museum. But unfortunately, it never happened, and he went back home, and about a year later, he died.
Where did he live?
Small town in New Jersey.
Oh.
I don't have my Rolodex in front of me right here. Otherwise, I could have spun to his name and told you the name of the town.
Yeah, New Jersey's close enough.
Yeah. Well, he lived in New Jersey, in a fine home, and in the basement he had his collection.
Peter, weather notwithstanding, would you live in the Northeast or where you are? Say the weather was exactly the same in both places.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's when I came here for the Senior Professional Baseball League to write the Forever Boys, I drove from Ridgefield, Connecticut. It was the 30th of October, and I arrived down here on the 31st. And it was 72 degrees on October 31st. And there was the Don Cesar Hotel on St. Pete Beach, it's pink. And the sun was going down, and it was warm. And I thought to myself, I think I have found paradise, literally. And you know something? That was 1989, and this is 1917, and I still feel exactly the same way.
Was that your first trip down to Florida?
My first trip down to the West Coast.
Oh,
as
to the West
kid,
Coast, yeah.
We always, my parents, our family used to do Christmas vacation in Miami. We stayed at the Diplomat Hotel. I took tennis lessons from Fred Perry, that sort of thing when I was a kid. So I only knew from Miami and Fort Lauderdale. I had a friend who lived in Fort Lauderdale. I used to do the whole Christmas break thing in Fort Lauderdale.
Peter, you left the projects, it seems.
Well,
you escaped the projects.
What happened, quite frankly, was that when I went to the first meeting of the Senior League, which was at the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach, I wanted to spend the season with the West Palm Beach Tropics. Dick Williams was the manager of the West Palm Beach Tropics. The owner of the West Palm Beach Tropics is the fellow who owns the Boston Red Sox right now. They had some wonderful players. The big slugger for the Mets was in left field for the Tropics. So I wanted to spend the season with them. But I had just written personal fouls with Jim Valvano and gotten Valvano fired. And the PR guy for the West Palm Beach Tropics was a friend of Valvano's, as it turned out. So he said, there ain't no way that you can spend the season with us. This was after they had accepted my doing it. I had plunked down, an advance money on a house on Fisher Island, and I was ready to go. But after that happens, I then called Jim Morley, who was the founder of the league, and he said, well, I've got this team in St. Petersburg, the St. Pete Pelicans. Why don't you come and spend the season with us? I had the commitment from the publisher to write this book, so I desperately needed a team to write about. So, the invitation to write about the Pelicans was a lifesaver in a sense. So when I came to St. Petersburg, it was with the notion that I would write this book about the St. Pete Pelicans. And as it turned out, the St. Pete Pelicans won the championship. Oh. And I made great friends among the players of the St. Pete Pelicans. They were very, very open with me. And I thought that the Forever Boys turned out to be a terrific piece of journalism because they were so open and wonderful.
Peter, I've said this time and time again. Not only did that book bring me to you, because I was just one guy doing a podcast, no network, nothing. And I read that book back in the 90s, took it out of the library, and it got me through some tough times. As books will do, that book became my friend. And I think had I approached you to say, I'd love to have you on my podcast, we could talk about Dynasty, or we could talk about bums. You must have had 80 times in your life that talked about Dynasty and bums on the radio. It wouldn't have made any difference. But we talked early on about Forever Boys,
Yeah.
And I quickly realized that was the book of your life. It wasn't that, for you. It was the book of your life because it changed the way you lived the rest of your life, and it enabled you to it's easy to find something interesting to write about Roger Maris, but you got to stretch to find something interesting to write about Joe Slobodnik. That's
yeah, but it's funny when you get to know these people and they get to know you, and they sit down and confide with you. Everybody who plays Major League Baseball has got an interesting story. I don't care who it is. The problem, of course, is to find a publisher who will let you, to publish a book about it.
Right.
20 years ago, it was a lot easier. Today, it's almost impossible. So, but different books have different moments in a person's life. If I had gone down at Prentice Hall where I was working as a lawyer, and I had said to the fellow down there, I want to write a history of the Boston Red Sox, he would have said to me, who are you? I have no interest in doing it. However, I went down and I said to him, I want to write this history of the New York Yankees, and he was a Yankee fan. And so he gave me that book contract. If he hadn't given me the book contract, I'd never, I've written 66 or 67 books. I probably wouldn't have written any. Because the hardest part in the book business is getting your start.
Yeah.
He gave me my start.
Peter, you've written 60 some odd books?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
I'm awed by that number. I truly am.
I'm awed in the sense that I haven't read 60 some odd books.
Dynasty, Bronx Zoo, Number One, Guidry, Bums, The Forever Boys, Fenway, American Zoom, Wild High and Tight, Wrigleyville, The Last Lap, Spirit of St. Louis, Amazing, NASCAR Confidential, Idiot, Landry's Boys, Miracle, Mickey Mantle the Novel, In the Country of Brooklyn, Tony Curtis, George, Growing Up NASCAR, Presumed Guilty, Driven by Donald Driver. Those are some of them.
Yeah. Oh, come on, you're reading them off the shelf. You haven't memorized them. I'm kidding.
Can you imagine having a shelf that you can read?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I'm still awed. Believe me. I tip my hat to you, Peter.
Well, thank you.
Well, anyway, guys, nice show. Nice week. I'm glad I introduced you to Peter. David Hubler and I both converse on two different shows on this network. One is at 12 o'clock Eastern on Sundays.
Sunday, yeah.
It's just talking baseball in the zone.
I think the one show on Sunday is enough talk, quite frankly.
Well, okay. Well, if ever you're up and just want to chat, and you don't have to come every week or anything. And on Tuesday nights, Hal Bach, David Hubler, George Case, Alan Blumkin, and I know I'm for Don Stokes. We have a vintage sports from the Old Garden, from Nedick's at the Old Garden. We do that at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Same numbers if ever you want to talk baseball, basketball,
we can talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, Ralph, the reason I backed out this afternoon because I felt it was too crowded. There's six people. To me, that's too much.
Okay.
Too many.
We'll try to keep the number.
I didn't want to offend anybody, but when it's that big a crowd and that kind of a time limit we have, it's it's hard to get a word in edgewise.
All right, folks, have a great week.
Okay, you too.
Okay, take care.
Appreciate it. David will talk Tuesday. Alan will talk Tuesday. Be well. If anybody out there likes what we're doing, please be kind enough to box up some children's books, some lightly used children's books, and take them to the Head Start program in whatever community you live in, get kids reading, ready for school, and off the streets. So if you could do that, that'd make me happy. If you didn't like the show, go down to the Head Start program, steal some children's books, bring them home. No, only kidding. Please do that, and we will be back next week. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tyko, the weak link of it all. Adios, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.